By the 17th and 18th centuries, Britain was not only conquering lands and expanding trade, but it was also taxing the world. From North America to the Caribbean, from India to West Africa. Taxes, duties, and tariffs funded the empire, its administration, and its wars. Every shipment of sugar, tobacco, cotton, or tea carried a hidden cost determined by British officials in London. Through taxation, Britain controlled economies, influenced societies, and shaped global commerce. But how did a small island nation impose taxes across continents? And what impact did these policies have on the people living under empire? Hello, my dear friend. I hope you are doing well today. Thank you for joining me on this journey into one of the most critical and controversial aspects of British imperial history. This story is not just about money. It is about power, administration, and the ways Britain projected authority over colonies and trade networks worldwide. Through taxation, parliament, administrators, and merchants intertwined governance, commerce, and coercion to sustain the empire. Before we begin, consider this question: were Britannia's taxes tools for economic organization, or instruments of exploitation designed to benefit the empire at the expense of its colonies? In the early 17th century, Britain began implementing structured customs and duties. Ports along the Atlantic, including Virginia, Bermuda, and various Caribbean settlements, became centers of trade regulation. Merchants arriving from Europe or other colonies were required to declare their cargoes, detailing quantities of tobacco, sugar, cotton, and other commodities. This process established accountability, ensuring that the Crown received its share of profits from burgeoning colonial commerce. Customs officers inspected ships, verifying that duties were correctly calculated and recorded. They maintained logs of arrivals, departures, and the value of goods, creating a paper trail that allowed administrators in London to monitor trade activity thousands of miles away. These records were critical not only for taxation but also for intelligence, providing insight into economic patterns, popular commodities, and potential smuggling routes. Revenue generated from these duties became an essential source of funds for the Crown, financing both domestic initiatives and overseas operations. The system of duties applied to both imports and exports. Goods brought into the colonies from Britain, Europe, or Africa were subject to tariffs. Tobacco from Virginia and Maryland, sugar and rum from the Caribbean, and other agricultural and mineral products were carefully assessed before leaving the ports. Duties were designed to maximize royal revenue while maintaining a competitive advantage for British merchants, subtly controlling trade flows and favoring imperial economic interests. Merchants learned to navigate these requirements, often employing agents or clerks to manage paperwork, calculate tariffs, and ensure compliance. Some sought to evade duties through smuggling or underreporting, leading to the establishment of enforcement mechanisms and legal consequences for fraud. Courts and magistrates were empowered to adjudicate disputes, impose fines, and seize contraband, reinforcing the authority of the Crown over colonial trade. This early system of customs and duties laid the groundwork for a broader imperial fiscal framework. By standardizing revenue collection, Britain could project administrative power across vast distances. The mechanisms developed during this period were later expanded to include additional commodities, more detailed record-keeping, and more sophisticated monitoring of shipping routes. These systems facilitated long-term imperial planning and provided the financial resources necessary for the expansion of naval power and colonial administration. Enforcement of duties also shaped colonial economies. Producers and planters adjusted production to account for tariffs and market demand. Shipping schedules and trade routes were influenced by ports with favorable duties or lower risks of inspection. The customs framework encouraged centralized planning, aligning local economic activity with broader imperial objectives. Merchants, planters, and colonial officials all interacted within this system, creating a dynamic environment where economic opportunity, regulation, and oversight were intertwined. The personnel involved in customs collection became vital to the functioning of empire. Officers were trained to assess goods accurately, detect smuggling, and maintain detailed records. Clerks, scribes, and accountants ensured that every transaction was logged and transmitted to the authorities in London. These records allowed policymakers to make informed decisions about tariffs, trade policies, and colonial investment. Information flowed back to the Crown, enabling a level of economic oversight that underpinned Britain's growing global influence. Customs duties were not merely economic tools, they also served political and strategic purposes. By regulating trade, Britain reinforced its authority over colonies, establishing the Crown as the ultimate arbiter of economic activity. Control over ports and taxation strengthened loyalty among colonial elites who benefited from sanctioned trade while discouraging unauthorized competition. The system reinforced hierarchical structures, ensuring that colonial commerce advanced imperial interests rather than local autonomy. As the decades progressed, the lessons learned from early customs enforcement informed broader fiscal policies. Britain applied similar frameworks in additional colonies, adapting rules to local conditions while maintaining core principles of accountability, record-keeping, and taxation. The experience gained during the early 1600s provided a template for revenue collection that would endure, influencing systems in India, Africa, and the Caribbean, and shaping the economic underpinnings of the British Empire. In summary, the establishment of customs and duties in Britannia's early colonies between 1600 and 1650 was a foundational element of imperial administration. By imposing tariffs on imports and exports, maintaining detailed records, and enforcing compliance, Britain created a system that generated revenue, regulated commerce, and strengthened authority across the Atlantic world. These mechanisms fostered economic growth, provided critical funding for expansion, and served as a model for subsequent fiscal and administrative practices that would support the empire for centuries. The combination of trade oversight, enforcement, and record-keeping demonstrates how early fiscal policy was central to the development of British global power, connecting colonies to the Crown, and shaping the trajectory of imperial ambition. From the mid-17th century, Britain faced the challenge of controlling trade across a growing network of overseas colonies. The Navigation Acts, passed by Parliament beginning in 1651, were designed to ensure that commerce enriched the mother country. These laws reflected the mercantilist belief that colonies existed primarily to provide raw materials and markets for British goods, and that economic control was central to national power and security. The Acts required that all goods imported to England from the colonies be carried on English ships or ships owned by English subjects. This regulation strengthened the British shipping industry while ensuring that colonial products, including sugar, tobacco, and cotton, contributed to the wealth of Britain rather than benefiting foreign competitors. Merchant fleets expanded as shipowners took advantage of these legal protections, increasing Britannia's capacity to transport goods efficiently across the Atlantic. Goods from Europe destined for the colonies were also affected. The Navigation Acts stipulated that products from other nations had to first pass through England before reaching colonial ports. This gave Britain control over the flow of trade, allowed officials to collect customs duties, and ensured that economic activity reinforced the prosperity of the nation. By channeling commerce through English ports, the Acts transformed trade into a mechanism of national policy, linking economic regulation with imperial oversight. The enforcement of the Navigation Acts relied on a network of port officials, customs officers, and colonial authorities. Shipments were inspected, cargoes were recorded, and duties were collected to maintain compliance. Officials monitored both the ships arriving from colonies and those departing, preventing illicit trade and reducing the influence of foreign merchants. This bureaucratic oversight strengthened Britannia's control over distant territories and provided a foundation for a predictable and profitable system of commerce. Colonial reactions to the Navigation Acts were mixed. Some merchants adapted to the new requirements, benefiting from participation in a controlled market with British protection. Others found the restrictions burdensome, as the laws limited their ability to trade directly with other European powers. Smuggling became a common response, reflecting the tension between local economic ambitions and metropolitan regulations. The Acts provided the framework within which colonial trade operated for decades, shaping the economic landscape of the empire. The Navigation Acts also reinforced the strategic integration of trade and naval power. By ensuring that commerce moved along English-controlled routes, Britain could protect shipping with the Royal Navy. Merchant convoys traveled under naval escort when necessary, safeguarding the movement of goods and asserting British authority over international waters. Control of trade routes became inseparable from maritime strength, demonstrating the link between economic policy and military capability. In practice, the Acts influenced the daily operations of merchants, shipowners, and colonial administrators. Shipping manifests had to comply with regulations, port entries were recorded meticulously, and customs officers verified the origin and destination of each cargo. The system provided transparency and accountability, allowing London to maintain oversight even over distant colonies. By standardizing procedures and documentation, Britain could manage complex trade networks effectively, ensuring that wealth flowed through the mother country. Over time, the Navigation Acts became more comprehensive, extending to a wider range of products and regions. They addressed emerging challenges in colonial trade and reflected the evolution of Britannia's imperial strategy. Sugar, indigo, tobacco, and other commodities were regulated carefully to maximize revenue and maintain control over production and distribution. The legislation not only regulated shipping but also shaped patterns of settlement, labor, and investment, reinforcing the broader structure of imperial dominance. Sugar, indigo, tobacco, and other commodities were regulated carefully to maximize revenue and maintain control over production and distribution. The economic impact of the Navigation Acts was substantial. Duties collected under these laws contributed to Britannia's fiscal strength, funding government operations, naval expansion, and overseas administration. By limiting the advantages of foreign merchants and directing trade through English channels, the Acts helped create a monopoly that strengthened Britannia's global position. This integration of commerce and state power became a defining feature of the British Empire during the 17th century. In conclusion, the Navigation Acts of 1651 to 1700 exemplified the use of law to shape the Empiria's economic foundation. By controlling the transport and distribution of colonial goods, Parliament ensured that trade benefited Britain while consolidating imperial authority. Enforcement through bureaucratic oversight, combined with naval protection, allowed Britain to maintain a profitable and secure system of commerce. The Acts not only regulated shipping and duties but also reinforced the strategic relationship between economic policy and national power, laying the groundwork for centuries of British influence in global trade. In conclusion, the Navigation Acts of 1651 to 1700 exemplified the use of law to shape the Empiria's economic foundation. In the first half of the 18th century, sugar dominated the Caribbean economy, and with it came a complex system of taxation and oversight designed to benefit Britain. Plantations in Barbados, Jamaica, and other islands produced vast quantities of sugar, molasses, and rum, commodities that were in high demand across Europe. To ensure revenue flowed back to the imperial coffers, British officials monitored every stage of production and trade, enforcing duties on exports while regulating the sale and movement of goods within and beyond the colonies. Collectors and administrators were stationed across the islands, keeping careful records of the output from each estate. Sugar mills were inspected regularly, with officials verifying quantities processed and ensuring that any evasion of duties was reported and punished. Ships leaving the islands for European ports were scrutinized, cargoes measured, and customs fees applied before departure. The meticulous enforcement of taxes meant that the crown could fund colonial administration and maintain defenses against threats from rival nations or pirates, securing the economic and strategic value of the Caribbean. The taxation system served multiple purposes. Beyond funding administrative costs, duties on sugar and its byproducts increased the profitability of plantations for British merchants, who controlled trade networks, ensuring that profits remained within the empire. This reinforced a cycle where colonies produced raw materials, Britain processed and traded them, and wealth accumulated in metropolitan centers. Merchants and planters adapted to this system by maintaining careful accounts and coordinating shipments to maximize returns. Despite the heavy taxation, but also meant that planters were acutely aware of the economic power wielded by British authorities. Enforcement was strict, and penalties for underreporting or smuggling sugar were severe, demonstrating the imperial commitment to controlling both production and revenue. The duties were not limited to sugar alone. Molasses, an essential byproduct, and rum, distilled from sugar, were also taxed. These products were critical to colonial and European markets, and taxes on them ensured continued financial support for the empire. By managing these levies, Britain maintained authority over colonial economies, directing wealth toward imperial priorities while sustaining the infrastructure needed for governance and defense. Colonial administrators also had to navigate the social and labor dynamics on plantations. Enslaved workers formed the backbone of sugar production, and their labor was central to the output on which duties were levied. Officials rarely interfered with the daily operations of labor, but relied on estate owners to maintain production levels. By taxing the products rather than the labor, Britain focused on revenue generation, without direct involvement in the brutal enforcement of plantation work, though the system depended entirely on forced labor. Shipping and port logistics were equally critical. Ports were equipped with warehouses, scales, and inspection points to verify the quantity and quality of sugar and related products. Officials recorded every transaction, ensuring that duties were applied correctly before goods were loaded onto ships bound for England or other European destinations. The combination of production oversight and shipping regulation created a tightly controlled system, minimizing the loss of revenue and maintaining Britannia's dominance in the sugar trade. This system also reinforced economic hierarchy within the colonies. Merchants who controlled export channels benefited from the arrangement, while smaller planters and intermediaries often faced tighter scrutiny and higher costs. By structuring taxation in a way that favored established networks, Britain ensured that wealth accumulation remained concentrated, and that colonial economies remained tied to imperial interests. The presence of officials and the administration of duties became a visible reminder of metropolitan authority, shaping social and economic interactions across the islands. The impact of these duties extended beyond immediate revenue. By regulating the sugar trade, Britain influenced investment patterns, production priorities, and the flow of labor and capital. Plantation owners planned cultivation, harvest, and shipment around duty schedules, while merchants coordinated trade routes to maximize efficiency and minimize loss. This created a structured economic environment that prioritized imperial profit, demonstrating the centrality of taxation to maintaining Britannia's global power. By the mid-18th century, sugar duties were a cornerstone of imperial finance. The careful monitoring of production, the imposition of customs fees, and the management of trade networks ensured a steady flow of wealth from the Caribbean to Britain. These duties were not simply financial instruments, they were mechanisms through which Britain exercised authority, structured colonial economies, and projected power across the Atlantic. In conclusion, sugar duties between 1700 and 1750 illustrate the intricate relationship between colonial production, imperial administration, and economic strategy. The taxation of sugar, molasses, and rum secured revenue for governance and defense, while enhancing the profitability of plantations for British merchants. Oversight at every stage from mills to ports ensured compliance, and demonstrated the Imperia's capacity to manage distant territories effectively. Through these duties, Britain maintained economic dominance, reinforced social hierarchies, and projected authority across the Caribbean, establishing a model of fiscal control that would shape colonial administration for decades to come. In the decades following the 7 Years' War, Britain faced the challenge of managing and defending its North American colonies. The conflict had been costly, and the empire sought to recover financially, while maintaining authority over its expanding territories. Parliament turned to taxation as a means of offsetting war expenses and funding the ongoing presence of troops in the colonies. In 1765, the Stamp Act imposed direct taxes on a wide range of printed materials, including legal documents, newspapers, and playing cards. Every item required a government-issued stamp, representing payment of the tax. This measure marked a significant expansion of imperial authority into the daily lives of colonists, who had previously governed much of their internal affairs with relative autonomy. The act was intended to make the colonies contribute fairly to their own defense and the costs of empire. Shortly afterward, the Townshend Acts of 1767 introduced duties on imported goods such as paper, paint, glass, and tea. These taxes applied at ports and aimed to generate revenue while reinforcing the principle that Parliament had the right to tax colonies. Unlike the Stamp Act, these duties were indirect, included in the price of imported items, but they were no less contentious. The legislation reflected Britannia's desire to maintain financial control over colonies and sustain its global commitments, particularly the expense of garrisons stationed along the frontier. Colonists reacted with growing resistance, fueled by the belief that taxation without representation violated their rights. Local assemblies, merchants, and ordinary citizens began organizing protests, boycotts, and petitions to challenge parliamentary authority. Communities united in boycotts of British goods, forming committees to enforce compliance and demonstrate solidarity against what they perceived as unfair taxation. The response was also cultural and symbolic. Public demonstrations, pamphlets, and assemblies conveyed a shared sense of grievance and identity. Town meetings became forums for discussing the implications of British policy, while newspapers and newsletters spread news and ideas rapidly. Merchants and tradespeople coordinated economic resistance, refusing to import taxed goods, while ordinary citizens expressed discontent through rallies, petitions, and local resolutions. These actions underscored the capacity of communities to organize and assert influence over imperial policies. Parliament attempted to enforce compliance through officials, customs officers, and legal measures, but smuggling and avoidance of duties were widespread, and colonial resistance often included intimidation of tax collectors and other representatives of authority. The visible presence of British troops, intended to maintain order, often heightened friction rather than reducing it. The economic impact of the taxes extended beyond direct revenue. Boycotts and non-importation agreements disrupted trade and affected both colonial and British merchants. The resulting tension highlighted the interconnected nature of the Imperial's economy, where decisions in London reverberated across the Atlantic. These pressures forced both sides to consider the costs of enforcement and resistance, demonstrating the fragile balance between imperial control and local autonomy. The period also fostered political innovation within the colonies. Committees of correspondence were established to coordinate responses across regions, sharing information and strategies for resisting British legislation. Colonial leaders articulated principles of self-governance and consent, laying the intellectual groundwork for broader political movements. These networks connected urban and rural communities, creating a shared identity that transcended individual settlements and reinforced collective action. As disputes over taxation intensified, incidents such as the Boston Massacre and the Tea Act of 1773 brought national attention to colonial grievances. The enforcement of these policies, combined with visible resistance, created cycles of protest and reprisal that further strained imperial-colonial relations. Parliament's insistence on revenue collection and colonial compliance highlighted the challenges of managing distant territories with growing populations increasingly aware of their rights and influence. By the mid-1770s, tensions had escalated to a point where compromise seemed increasingly unlikely. The taxes imposed between 1750 and 1775 were not merely financial measures, they were a test of authority, loyalty, and the limits of imperial governance. The American colonies had developed systems of communication, organization, and public expression capable of challenging parliamentary decisions. The struggle over the Stamp Act, Townshend Acts, and other levies demonstrated that taxation could no longer be separated from questions of representation, rights, and the legitimacy of imperial power. In summary, the period between 1750 and 1775 in North America was marked. Parliament's attempts to raise revenue through the Stamp Act and Townshend Acts were driven by the need to fund defense and assert authority, yet they provoked resistance that challenged both economic and political control. Colonial responses combined economic, political, and social strategies, fostering unity and a shared identity. These tensions set the stage for revolutionary developments, showing how taxation and governance intersected with broader questions of rights, representation, and the relationship between empire and colony. The legacy of these years illustrates the complex dynamics of authority, protest, and emerging self-governance that shaped the path toward American independence. After the Battle of Plassey in 1757, the East India Company entered a new phase of power in India. No longer limited to coastal trade or negotiated commercial outposts, the company assumed the authority to collect revenue in Bengal. Land taxes, trade tariffs, and levies on goods flowed from local economies into company accounts. Revenue collection became the foundation upon which British influence expanded. The story of this century is the story of how money, not armies alone, reshaped India's future. Company officials introduced systems that redefined ownership and responsibility. Land taxes were assessed not according to tradition, but according to new administrative categories. Fields that had once been managed by local rulers or village councils now fell under company oversight. Surveyors marked property lines and documented holdings. Tax collectors recorded names, yields, and obligations in ledgers. The process divided land into units that could be measured, taxed, and enforced. For many, this meant adapting to an unfamiliar system that demanded revenue regardless of harvest or hardship. These taxes funded British operations. Revenue paid the salaries of administrators, supported military garrisons, and financed new territorial campaigns. Money raised in Bengal helped sustain conflicts elsewhere, linking Indian fields to imperial ambitions. The flow of capital turned India into a financial engine for expansion. Revenue collectors received strict instructions. Targets were set. Shortfalls required explanation. Administration hardened into routine. Behind every figure in a ledger stood a community expected to meet demands. Trade tariffs extended this system into markets and ports. Cotton, silk, and indigo passed through customs houses where duties were calculated. Salt, a necessity in daily life, became a taxable commodity. Fees increased the cost of goods, affecting traders and consumers alike. Opium became another source of income. Under company regulation, cultivation and sale produced revenue that influenced global trade. The network of taxation reached from farms to trading ports, binding local activity to distant objectives. The pressure of revenue collection affected daily life. Farmers faced uncertainty. They adjusted planting decisions to meet tax requirements. Some borrowed against future harvests. When crops failed, tax obligations remained. In difficult years, the inability to meet expectations placed communities at risk. Famine did not arrive because of taxes alone, but the system left little room for relief. Administrative reports recorded shortages, yet collection often continued. The system demanded revenue even when reality demanded mercy. Company officials debated reforms as consequences became clear. Some argued for flexibility in assessment. Others insisted that consistent revenue ensured stability. Attempts to revise land policies emerged in different regions. The permanent settlement in Bengal fixed tax obligations in an attempt to create predictability. It created new classes of landholders with long-term claims. Supporters hoped it would encourage agricultural investment. Critics argued it placed wealth in the hands of a few while leaving farmers vulnerable. The results shaped Bengala's social and economic landscape for generations. In Madras and Bombay, alternative systems tied taxation to land productivity, requiring assessment after each season. Survey teams measured yields and adjusted expectations. This method allowed for variation but demanded constant oversight. These approaches reflected different administrative philosophies. Yet both relied on the same principle. Revenue defined authority. The company governed through financial expectation rather than shared decision-making. The link between revenue and military expansion remained constant. Funds collected in Bengal supported campaigns in Mysore, Maratha territories, and beyond. Wars changed borders, and borders changed who paid taxes. Each victory expanded the area under company control. Each new territory required administrative integration. Military success increased responsibility. Revenue sustained it. The cycle continued. Trade cities became administrative hubs. Calcutta grew into a center of finance and governance. Courthouses, treasury offices, and customs buildings appeared near docks and warehouses. The city reflected the logic of the revenue system. Markets thrived or declined according to company policy. Merchants navigated new regulations. Officials calculated income with increasing precision. The rhythms of commerce became synchronized with the needs of the administration. Communication strengthened the network. Reports traveled to London detailing revenue results and regional challenges. Letters returned with instructions, expectations, and justification. Decisions made thousands of miles away shaped policy on the ground. Distance required clarity. The company issued manuals and guidelines to standardize procedure. Bureaucracy became a substitute for presence. Paperwork became a stand-in for direct rule. As years passed, opposition grew. Farmers protested unfair assessments. Merchants complained about tariffs that restricted competition. Some local rulers challenged company authority. Tensions did not end the system, but they revealed its limits. Debate spread within Britain as well. Critics questioned whether a trading company should administer territory. Others argued that the company's economic success justified its authority. The discussion would eventually reach Parliament and alter the future of British rule. By 1857, frustration and resistance erupted into open conflict. The uprising spread across northern and central India, signaling that the balance between authority and expectation had broken. After the suppression of the revolt, the British government dissolved the Compania's administrative role. In 1858, authority transferred to the British Crown. Revenue collection continued, but under new oversight. The company era ended, yet the structures it built did not vanish. The legacy of revenue collection from 1757 to 1858 lies in more than finance. It lies in the reshaping of land, labor, and authority. It altered relationships between rulers and subjects, merchants and markets, farmers and fields. It created systems that endured into later colonial rule and influenced regional economies long after independence. The story of this century is a reminder that governance can operate through numbers as effectively as through armies. Between taxes, tariffs, and duties, the East India Company built an administrative world that rewrote the relationship between India and Britain. It made commerce into governance and calculation into policy. This legacy remains, not only in history books, but in the structures of administration, land law, and economic memory that shaped modern India. Between 1650 and 1800, West Africa became a central node in the transatlantic triangular trade, linking Europe, Africa, and the Americas in a system of commerce and exploitation. British merchants played a pivotal role, exchanging manufactured goods for enslaved labor, which was then transported across the Atlantic to work on plantations producing sugar, tobacco, and cotton. Every step of this trade was subject to taxation, both by local authorities and by imperial oversight, ensuring that the crown and trading companies captured revenue from the exchange. Ports along the West African coast were hubs of commerce and control. British merchants brought textiles, firearms, alcohol, and other goods, paying duties and taxes to operate within designated trading forts, creating zones where imperial influence could be asserted with minimal military presence, establishing economic dominance even in areas where political authority was contested. Enslaved individuals were treated as commodities within this system, and taxes were levied on their purchase, transport, and sale. British traders recorded every transaction, ensuring that duties were paid and profits were documented. These records enabled officials in London to monitor trade flows and calculate revenue with precision, tying distant regions into a coordinated imperial economy. The revenue collected from West African trade supported naval patrols, colonial administration, and further expansion into new markets. The triangular trade relied on the movement of goods in three stages: manufactured items from Britain and Europe, sailed to African ports, where they were exchanged for enslaved people. The Middle Passage carried captives across the Atlantic to the Americas, where their labor produced raw materials. These commodities were then shipped back to Europe, completing the triangle. Duties were applied at multiple points, reinforcing the financial integration of the empire, and ensuring that the crown profited from each leg of the journey. Economic exploitation was intertwined with political strategy. By controlling taxation and trade, Britain could influence local African polities, negotiate favorable treaties, and maintain access to labor and resources. Customs officers, clerks, and administrators documented every transaction, creating an infrastructure of oversight that extended imperial authority without requiring a permanent large-scale presence. This system allowed Britain to project power economically and politically across vast distances. Merchants and colonial agents adapted to the complexities of taxation and trade regulations. Smuggling and underreporting were challenges that authorities combated through inspections, record-keeping, and legal penalties. The enforcement of duties required coordination between forts, ships, and officials both in Africa and in European ports. This logistical effort demonstrated the Imperia's capacity to manage a global economic network and highlighted the central role of fiscal policy in sustaining imperial ambitions. The taxation framework also shaped the nature of trade and production. The profitability of trade influenced the scale of human trafficking, the allocation of goods, and the timing of voyages. Economic incentives created a system where exploitation and profit were inseparable, embedding British influence deeply into the transatlantic economy. Over time, the triangular trade became a defining feature of Britannia's imperial strategy. Taxes on goods and enslaved labor provided consistent revenue streams, while customs regulations reinforced hierarchical control over distant regions. The system linked West Africa, the Americas, and Europe in a network that enabled Britain to expand its global reach and consolidate power. Enforcement of duties, combined with detailed record-keeping, allowed London to oversee trade with remarkable precision, despite the vast distances involved. This integration of taxation, trade, and imperial authority exemplifies the dual role of commerce and governance in empire building. Revenue from the triangular trade financed naval operations, colonial administration, and further expansion into Asia, Africa, and the Americas. Customs officers, merchants, and administrators formed an interconnected bureaucracy that supported both economic exploitation and imperial oversight, demonstrating the sophistication and ambition of British strategy. By the end of the 18th century, the triangular trade had transformed the Atlantic world. West African societies were reshaped by the demands of commerce, European economies grew dependent on enslaved labor, and colonial revenues strengthened Britannia's global position. Taxes were central to this system, providing both fiscal benefit and political leverage. They enabled Britain to exert influence across continents, control trade networks, and sustain the economic engine of empire. In conclusion, the period from 1650 to 1800 in West Africa illustrates how taxation and trade were inseparable components of British imperial power. Duties on goods and enslaved labor facilitated wealth accumulation, reinforced authority, and coordinated economic activity across the Atlantic world. The triangular trade demonstrates the interconnectedness of commerce, governance, and exploitation, showing how fiscal mechanisms allowed Britain to maintain control, project influence, and shape the course of global history through both economic and administrative strategies. Between 1650 and 1800, West Africa became a central node. British merchants played a pivotal role, exchanging manufactured goods, which was then transported across the Atlantic to work on plantations, producing sugar, tobacco, and cotton. Every step of this trade was subject to taxation, both by local authorities and by imperial oversight, ensuring that the crown and trading companies captured revenue from the exchange. Ports along the West African coast were hubs of commerce and control. British merchants brought textiles, firearms, alcohol, and other goods, paying duties and taxes to operate within designated trading forts. These forts not only regulated commerce but also projected British authority along the coast, creating zones where imperial influence could be asserted with minimal military presence. The taxation system reinforced this control, establishing economic dominance even in areas where political authority was contested. Enslaved individuals were treated as commodities within this system, and taxes were levied on their purchase, transport, and sale. British traders recorded every transaction, ensuring that duties were paid and profits were documented. These records enabled officials in London to monitor trade flows and calculate revenue with precision, tying distant regions into a coordinated imperial economy. The revenue collected from West African trade supported naval patrols, colonial administration, and further expansion into new markets. The triangular trade relied on the movement of goods in three stages. Manufactured items from Britain and Europe sailed to African ports, where they were exchanged for enslaved people. The Middle Passage carried captives across the Atlantic to the Americas, where their labor produced raw materials. These commodities were then shipped back to Europe, completing the triangle. Duties were applied at multiple points, reinforcing the financial integration of the empire, and ensuring that the crown profited from each leg of the journey. Economic exploitation was intertwined with political strategy. By controlling taxation and trade, Britain could influence local African polities, negotiate favorable treaties, and maintain access to labor and resources. Customs officers, clerks, and administrators documented every transaction, creating an infrastructure of oversight that extended imperial authority without requiring a permanent large-scale presence. This system allowed Britain to project power economically and politically across vast distances. Merchants and colonial agents adapted to the complexities of taxation and trade regulations. Smuggling and underreporting were challenges that authorities combated through inspections, record-keeping, and legal penalties. The enforcement of duties required coordination between forts, ships, and officials both in Africa and in European ports. This logistical effort demonstrated the Imperia's capacity to manage a global economic network and highlighted the central role of fiscal policy in sustaining imperial ambitions. The taxation framework also shaped the nature of trade and production. The profitability of trade influenced the scale of human trafficking, the allocation of goods, and the timing of voyages. Economic incentives created a system where exploitation and profit were inseparable, embedding British influence deeply into the transatlantic economy. Over time, the triangular trade became a defining feature of Britannia's imperial strategy. Taxes on goods and enslaved labor provided consistent revenue streams, while customs regulations reinforced hierarchical control over distant regions. The system linked West Africa, the Americas, and Europe in a network that enabled Britain to expand its global reach and consolidate power. Enforcement of duties, combined with detailed record-keeping, allowed London to oversee trade with remarkable precision, despite the vast distances involved. This integration of taxation, trade, and imperial authority exemplifies the dual role of commerce and governance in empire building. Revenue from the triangular trade financed naval operations, colonial administration, and further expansion into Asia, Africa, and the Americas. Customs officers, merchants, and administrators formed an interconnected bureaucracy that supported both economic exploitation and imperial oversight, demonstrating the sophistication and ambition of British strategy. By the end of the 18th century, the triangular trade had transformed the Atlantic world. West African societies were reshaped by the demands of commerce. European economies grew dependent on enslaved labor, and colonial revenues strengthened Britannia's global position. Taxes were central to this system, providing both fiscal benefit and political leverage. They enabled Britain to exert influence across continents, control trade networks, and sustain the economic engine of empire. In conclusion, the period from 1650 to 1800 in West Africa illustrates how taxation and trade were inseparable components of British imperial power. Duties on goods and enslaved labor facilitated wealth accumulation, reinforced authority, and coordinated economic activity across the Atlantic world. The triangular trade demonstrates the interconnectedness of commerce, governance, and exploitation, showing how fiscal mechanisms allowed Britain to maintain control, project influence, and shape the course of global history through both economic and administrative strategies. Throughout the 18th and 19th centuries, Britannia's global conflicts placed immense demands on the Imperia's financial resources. Wars with France, Spain, and later other European powers required fleets of ships, well-supplied garrisons, and the mobilization of troops across oceans. Financing these campaigns relied heavily on Parliament's ability to levy taxes, not only on domestic subjects, but also on colonies and trade networks spanning the Atlantic and beyond. Colonial taxation became a crucial tool in funding military operations. Duties on imported goods, export tariffs, and levies on commodities such as sugar, tobacco, and cotton ensured that wealth generated overseas could contribute directly to the Imperia's defense. Merchants, planters, and administrators understood that their profits were entwined with military expenditure, and compliance with taxation was enforced rigorously. The relationship between revenue collection and warfare underscored how military power depended on controlled commerce. During periods of heightened conflict, Parliament authorized extraordinary measures to secure funds. The War of Spanish Succession, for example, prompted additional duties on colonial goods. While the 7 Years' War saw the introduction of new taxes designed to offset the costs of global campaigns. These levies were carefully calculated to generate maximum revenue without completely disrupting trade. Demonstrating a balance between economic strategy and military necessity. Collectors and colonial administrators implemented these taxes through a structured bureaucracy. Officials monitored production, recorded shipments, and ensured that duties were applied at multiple points, from ports to plantations. Ships leaving the colonies for Europe were inspected, and cargoes measured to verify that appropriate taxes had been paid. This system allowed Britain to maintain the flow of resources needed to fund its armies and navies while reinforcing imperial authority. Military expenditure shaped not only taxation policies but also colonial priorities. Territories rich in commodities essential for trade and war were given additional oversight, with officials enforcing duties more strictly to ensure consistent revenue. Fortifications, naval bases, and supply depots were financed through these collections, linking the economy of colonies directly to military strength. The integration of taxation and defense illustrates how economic control was central to sustaining Britannia's global empire. In times of war, new taxes often provoked tension and resistance, especially in North America. Colonists, accustomed to a degree of local autonomy, resented levies imposed to fund distant conflicts, seeing them as burdensome and intrusive. Measures such as the Stamp Act and Townshend duties exemplify the friction between revenue demands and local populations. Yet despite disputes, the underlying principle remained: taxation was essential for sustaining Britannia's military reach and protecting imperial interests. Trade routes themselves were strategic assets, and taxes helped ensure that they were maintained and defended. Duties on shipping supported port infrastructure and lighthouses and naval patrols, all necessary to safeguard commerce during wartime. By linking taxation to maritime security, Britain could project military power, while simultaneously benefiting economically, creating a system in which commerce and defense reinforced one another. Trade routes themselves were strategic assets, and taxes helped ensure that they were maintained and defended. The collection of taxes during wars was also closely monitored to prevent evasion. Smuggling and underreporting threatened revenue, prompting stricter inspections and administrative oversight. Officials documented every transaction, ensuring that colonial wealth contributed to the Imperia's military needs. This vigilance illustrates the sophistication of Britannia's fiscal system and the degree to which economic control underpinned global power. Military campaigns themselves depended on reliable funding from these taxes. Armies deployed in India, Africa, and the Caribbean required food, weapons, and transport, all financed through colonial levies. Naval fleets patrolling Atlantic and Indian Ocean trade routes relied on similar support, linking taxation directly to the projection of power. Without this controlled revenue, Britannia's ability to maintain and defend its empire would have been severely constrained. Beyond immediate revenue, taxation influenced long-term colonial administration. Officials responsible for collecting duties gained experience in governance, record-keeping, and oversight, laying the foundations for broader bureaucratic control. Trade and taxation systems reinforced economic dependency on Britain, ensuring that colonies remained integrated into imperial objectives even after conflicts ended. In summary, between 1700 and Taxation during wars was a vital instrument for sustaining Britannia's military and economic supremacy. Duties on colonies and trade funded armies, navies, fortifications, and supply chains, linking commerce directly to imperial defense. Administrative structures ensured compliance, monitored revenue, and maintained control, while resistance highlighted the tension inherent in distant rule. This interplay of taxation and military expenditure demonstrates how economic strategy and warfare were inseparable, securing Britannia's position as a global power for centuries. From the mid-18th century onward, Britain relied on trade monopolies and indirect taxation to maintain, granting exclusive rights to chartered companies and key commodities such as sugar, tea, cotton, and spices remained under controlled production and distribution. These monopolies were not only instruments of commerce, but also tools of imperial governance, reinforcing authority through economic dependence. Prices for goods were often embedded with taxes and tariffs, allowing revenue to flow back to Britain without the need for direct collection. This indirect system created a dual benefit. The empire profited financially while maintaining a degree of separation from everyday administration, avoiding the visible burden of taxation that could provoke resistance. Colonial officials oversaw compliance, monitored shipments, and enforced regulations, creating a network that combined commercial efficiency with political oversight. Sugar from Caribbean plantations, for example, moved through carefully managed channels. Charter companies held exclusive rights to produce and ship the crop, and duties on imports ensured that the British government benefited from every transaction. Similar systems applied to tea imported from Asia, with the East India Company controlling both production and supply, embedding taxes into the cost while shaping local markets. These monopolies reflected Britannia's ability to combine economic control with the projection of soft power, as trade regulations dictated patterns of consumption, labor, and wealth across the empire. Colonial administrations were tasked with enforcing compliance, maintaining records, and resolving disputes that arose from trade monopolies. Courts, local magistrates, and customs officers played a vital role in upholding the system, ensuring that merchants and consumers adhered to regulations. Even as the population of colonies grew more sophisticated and trade networks expanded, the indirect taxation and monopoly framework allowed Britain to sustain revenue without constant direct intervention. The system relied on a balance between supervision and delegation, combining bureaucratic oversight with the self-interest of monopolized merchants. Economic incentives encouraged local elites to participate in the framework. Merchants who held licenses or contracts benefited from exclusive access, while ordinary traders were often excluded or required to pay additional duties. This created a hierarchy within colonial economies, reinforcing British authority while ensuring that those with influence had a vested interest in maintaining imperial structures. Profits from monopolized goods contributed to both metropolitan wealth and the funding of imperial projects, including naval defense infrastructure and administrative expansion. Indirect taxation also shaped daily life in the colonies. Imported goods carried embedded tariffs, influencing consumption patterns and social behaviors. Tea, sugar, and textiles were more expensive due to duties, affecting the choices of consumers and reinforcing the value of British regulation. Even local artisans and producers were affected by restrictions on trade, as monopolies controlled markets and dictated prices. The system created a web of economic control that extended from production in one continent to consumption in another, illustrating the global reach of British commerce. Resistance to monopolies and indirect taxes emerged gradually. Smuggling, illegal trade, and disputes over duties highlighted the tensions inherent in controlling distant markets. Colonial populations learned to navigate the system, sometimes circumventing regulations while still engaging with authorized channels. The British response combined enforcement with adaptation, using bureaucratic measures, penalties, and incentives to maintain the integrity of the system. These interactions demonstrated both the effectiveness and fragility of indirect control over complex, far-reaching trade networks. The integration of monopolies and indirect taxation also had strategic significance. By controlling the flow of key commodities, Britain could leverage its economic power in international relations. Access to resources influenced diplomatic negotiations, military planning, and colonial policy. Profits from trade supported naval dominance, enabling the empire to protect routes, enforce monopolies, and project power. The system of monopolies was thus not merely commercial, it was an instrument of strategic influence that reinforced Britannia's global position. Cultural and social consequences accompanied economic control. Monopolized goods carried symbolic value, representing British authority and prestige. Consumption patterns reflected status and allegiance, while participation in regulated trade signaled compliance with imperial norms. The interplay of economy, culture, and politics ensured that indirect taxes and monopolies extended influence beyond revenue generation, shaping colonial societies in ways that aligned with British objectives. Over the century from 1750 to 1850, these mechanisms evolved to meet changing circumstances. New ports, expanded shipping networks, and innovations in record-keeping allowed Britain to manage increasingly complex trade routes. Monopolies shifted in scope and scale, responding to economic opportunities, colonial growth, and geopolitical pressures. Throughout, the principles remained consistent: revenue through control, compliance through incentives, and authority reinforced through economic dependency. In conclusion, Britannia's use of trade monopolies and indirect taxation from 1750 to 1850 was a cornerstone of imperial administration and economic strategy. By embedding taxes in prices, granting exclusive rights to companies, and enforcing compliance through local authorities, the empire profited while maintaining influence over distant colonies. The system combined economic efficiency, bureaucratic oversight, and strategic planning, demonstrating how commerce and governance intertwined. Monopolies and indirect taxes not only generated wealth but also reinforced imperial authority, shaped social hierarchies, and maintained Britannia's global dominance across continents and decades. Legacy of Imperial Taxation 1800–1945. By the dawn of the 19th century, the British Empire had constructed more than a territorial network. It had built an economic structure powered by taxation. Through ports, customs houses, and administrative offices. Imperial tax policy threaded itself into the daily lives of millions. The empire was not held together only by ships or armies. It was held together by ledgers, tariffs, and the expectation that revenue would continue to flow. As the industrial era advanced, taxation and trade regulation shaped the movement of goods across continents. Railways in India, ports in Africa, and plantations in the Caribbean were financed and maintained through tax systems designed to serve imperial priorities. Duty collection on goods like tea, cotton, tobacco, and sugar created predictable streams of income. These funds supported colonial administration, infrastructure projects, and military expansion. Economic planning became impossible to separate from taxation. Every station platform, dockyard, and courthouse carried the imprint of imperial financial policy. Taxation influenced not only infrastructure but also social structure. In many colonies, small groups of local elites received administrative authority if they cooperated with revenue demands. These intermediaries connected distant capitals with rural landscapes. Their appointment reinforced hierarchy and loyalty. In growing urban centers, customs officers, auditors, and clerks formed a bureaucratic class whose role was to maintain the systems that sustained the Imperia's commerce. The rise of this administrative workforce represented a shift. Power was exercised invisibly, through paperwork rather than force alone. The early 20th century brought new pressures. Global trade expanded. Steamships increased maritime traffic. Telegraph lines linked financial centers. The empire adjusted by refining tax codes to handle new commodities and larger markets. In places like Egypt and Malaya, taxation supported modernization that aligned with imperial strategy. Rail lines constructed to move resources also moved tax revenue. The movement of goods and the movement of money became inseparable. Behind every shipment stood an invoice. Behind every invoice stood a tax office. Legal frameworks evolved to sustain these systems. These tools shaped modern economies long after the empire's political authority faded. The legacy of imperial taxation continued to influence the course of global economies. The First World War accelerated the transformation. Britain relied heavily on its colonies for both resources and revenue. War loans, special levies, and expanded tariffs became standard. In return, colonial leaders expected recognition and political concessions. Taxation grew into a central issue not just of economy, but of identity. People questioned why they funded wars in distant lands. Calls for representation grew louder. Economic obligation fueled political debate. The interwar years revealed the limits of the imperial model. The Great Depression strained every link in the financial chain. Commodity prices collapsed. Trade slowed. Yet tax systems remained rigid. In some regions, collection continued despite falling incomes. The system struggled to adapt, and frustration spread. Economic hardship eroded confidence. Movements for independence found strength in the argument that financial control meant political control. To challenge taxation was to challenge the empire itself. During the Second World War, taxation once again became a pillar of strategy. Military spending required unprecedented financial coordination. Colonies contributed through increased duties and special war taxes. Ports, railways, and telegraph lines functioned as arteries of supply. By 1945, the capacity to tax effectively had become synonymous with the capacity to govern. The promise of shared sacrifice collided with the reality of unequal authority. The structure of taxation that had once supported expansion now accelerated demands for autonomy. By the end of the war, the empire's future was uncertain. The pressure of maintaining global networks was unsustainable. Independence movements gained momentum. As decolonization unfolded, imperial institutions were dismantled. Yet taxation, the framework that had underpinned the empire, did not disappear. It remained embedded in new governments. Revenue offices continued to operate. Customs duties still shaped trade. The mechanisms designed for imperial needs became the foundation of national economies. This legacy reached beyond former colonies. International trade agreements, customs unions, and economic alliances reflected principles first tested under imperial administration. Maritime tariff rules influenced global shipping law. Standardized port inspections echoed procedures once enforced in colonial harbors. The language of finance, regulation, and revenue became an international vocabulary. The empire's financial architecture persisted, reassembled into the institutions of a new world order. The legacy of imperial taxation from 1800 to 1945 is not measured only in revenue numbers or commercial statistics. It is measured in systems that continue to define how nations interact. In tax courts where economic disputes are settled. In the balance sheets of governments that rely on inherited models of revenue collection. It lives in laws, borders, and expectations. It survives in the belief that economic stability depends on structured oversight. The legacy of imperial taxation. The story of imperial taxation is a story of invisible power. It demonstrates how empires can persist through institutions long after flags are lowered. It shows that legacies are not always monuments or map lines, but systems embedded in daily life. Taxation shaped infrastructure, influenced diplomacy, and reorganized societies. It continues to guide the flow of wealth, even when the empire that designed it no longer stands. The story of how Britain taxed the world reveals that empire was not only built with armies and ships but also with systems of finance, regulation, and control. Taxes allowed Britain to project power, fund administration, and dominate global commerce, often at the expense of colonial populations. May understanding imperial taxation help us see how power, money, and control shaped the modern world. Until next time, my friend, stay curious and continue exploring the stories that define nations.